A woman who has outlived nearly every soul she ever loved sits at the entrance of a cave carved into a mountainside. Her body is failing. Her breath comes slow and shallow. But her eyes are open, and they are fixed on something far beyond the rocks and the dust in front of her. Her son kneels beside her, waiting, because he knows that what she is about to say has never been spoken aloud before, not in this way, not with this much detail. This is the final testimony of the first woman who ever lived, and according to a set of writings preserved for centuries in the monasteries of the Ethiopian highlands, it is a testimony that changes everything we thought we understood about the Garden of Eden. For generations, these accounts were copied by hand in the Guizi language, guarded inside stone churches built into cliffsides, places so remote that outsiders rarely reached them. The texts describe a paradise that bears almost no resemblance to the simple garden most of us were taught about as children. They describe a final week in the life of the first woman, a week unlike anything else recorded in any tradition, 6 days that mirror the 6 days of creation itself. And at the center of it all is a memory she refused to let die with her. The memory of what Eden actually felt like, looked like, and meant before everything was lost. This is her story, gathered from the threads of those old Highland traditions and woven back together. Whether you come to it as history, as scripture, or simply as one of the oldest stories human beings have ever told about loss and hope, it deserves to be heard in full. The first thing she wanted her son to understand was the light. Not sunlight, not firelight, not anything he had ever experienced in the world outside the garden. She told him that inside Eden, light did not travel from one point to another. It did not rise in the east and set in the west. It simply existed, woven into everything at once. The ground held it. The leaves held it. Even the air itself seemed to carry a faint glow, as though the entire garden was lit from within rather than from above. She remembered standing beneath the canopy of the great trees and seeing no shadows pool beneath her feet, because there was nothing for the light to compete with. Everything was illuminated equally, gently, constantly. She told her son that she had spent the rest of her life, nearly 1,000 years by that point, waiting for the sun to rise just once the way that light used to surround her, and it never had. Not a single morning after the garden had ever come close. She described the rivers next. Of the 4 rivers that ran through Eden, she spoke most about the one whose beds shimmer with gold, not gold the way people mine it from the earth now, hard and lifeless, but gold that seemed to move beneath the surface of the water like something alive. She told her son that if you stood at the edge of that river and looked down, you could see the gold pulsing gently, almost like a heartbeat, visible even where the current ran fastest and deepest. The water itself was so clear that every grain of sand on the riverbed was visible, sharp and bright, no matter how far down it sat. Then there were the animals. She told Seth that in the garden, no creature feared another, and no creature feared her or Adam either. They came close on their own, curious and calm, the way a child might approach someone they trust completely. She remembered the serpent before its corruption as the most strikingly beautiful of all of them, more vivid and graceful than anything that walked the earth afterward. It was not a monster waiting to strike. It was simply one more wonder among countless wonders, until the moment everything changed. Of everything she remembered, nothing affected her son more than what she said about the tree of life. She did not describe it primarily as something to look at. She described it as something to feel. She said that simply being near the tree filled the body with a fragrance unlike any flower or fruit that existed in the world outside the garden, a fragrance that did not stay on the surface of the skin but seemed to sink inward, settling into the chest, into the breath itself. She told Seth that while she stood near that tree, fear did not exist. Not fear of death, not fear of loss, not fear of the future. The feeling it produced was closer to being wrapped in something warm and certain, a constant reassurance that everything was exactly as it should be. And she told him something that made the weight of her lost land all at once. She could still smell it. After nearly 1,000 years of exile, after a lifetime of sleeping on cold ground and working soil that resisted every effort, that fragrance had never faded from her memory. It remained as vivid and present as the day she had walked out of the garden for the last time. She warned her son not to mistake the world he knew for the world as it was meant to be. The thorns that tore at their hands every time they worked the fields, she said, were never part of the original design. They were new, added the moment everything changed, a permanent reminder of what had been lost. She was afraid that if she did not pass this memory on clearly enough, her grandchildren and their children after them would grow up believing that this broken world, full of thorns and hunger and short, hard lives, was simply how things had always been. She did not want her descendants to mistake the ruins for the original. She wanted them to know generation after generation that something better had existed once and that it could exist again. According to the old accounts, Adam died first, and the day of his death carried a quiet symmetry. It fell on the same day of the week he had been formed at the very beginning. But the woman who had stood beside him since the first morning of human history did not die with him. She lived 6 more days, and those 6 days were deliberately mirrored against the 6 days of creation itself. Just as the world had been built piece by piece, day by day, she now released her hold on that world piece by piece, day by day. For those 6 days, she carried something no other human being on earth could carry. She was the only person alive who had walked through Eden with her own feet, who had breathed its air, who had heard its sounds. Everyone else who had ever lived, every child, every grandchild, every great-grandchild down through generations had been born after the gates closed. They knew the world only as it was now, difficult, uncertain, marked by labor and loss. She alone remembered what it had been before. The old text described her sitting at the entrance of the cave where Adam's body had just been laid, refusing food, refusing water, her body weakening by the hour, even as her mind grew sharper than it had been in years. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, searching, as though she might catch even the faintest trace of the glow she remembered from the garden somewhere beyond the hills. She was not simply grieving her husband. She was standing at the exact midpoint between 2 worlds, the world of the living that surrounded her, full of her children and their children, and whatever lay ahead, the place Adam had just gone. For those 6 days, she alone could sense both. On the 4th day after Adam was buried, something shifted. In the middle of speaking, she simply stopped. Her eyes remained open, but she was no longer present in the cave with the people around her. Seth called her name. Other children and grandchildren tried gently to bring her back. Nothing reached her. According to the old accounts, she had entered a state that was neither sleep nor ordinary waking, a state in which her body remained in the cave while something else in her seemed to travel elsewhere entirely. Then, the texts say, the sky itself appeared to tear open above the cave, not gradually, but suddenly, violently, like fabric ripped apart by a force too strong to resist. And what she saw through that opening was not emptiness. She saw a vast shape of brilliant light descending, a chariot, surrounded by towering winged figures so enormous and so radiant that their light seemed to spread across the sky for miles. The light pouring from them was not like fire and not like sunlight. It was the same light she remembered from the garden, warm, alive, intentional, as though it carried meaning along with brightness. And on that chariot, surrounded by ranks of beings moving in perfect formation, she saw the soul of her husband. He was being carried upward, escorted by towering figures of light, the very first human soul in history to make that journey. No one before her had ever witnessed anything like it, because no one before this moment had existed long enough or lost enough to need to. What she saw next loosened something that had been tightened inside her for almost 1,000 years. In the vision, the figures of light brought Adam to a pool of impossibly clear water, and there they washed him, restoring something that had been taken from him at the moment they were both driven from the garden, a kind of brightness, a covering of light that had once surrounded them both and had vanished the instant they stepped outside its gates. In the vision, that brightness returned to him fully. He was made whole again. For the woman watching, this single image undid a weight she had carried every day of her life. The shame, the blame, the conviction that everything broken in the world traced back to a single moment and a single choice that was hers, all of it loosened. She watched her husband restored, and in that moment she understood something she had never let herself believe before. Death was not simply a punishment handed down and left to stand forever. It was a doorway. The exile was not the end of the story. And once she understood that, everything about her final hours changed. She was no longer a woman counting down toward an ending. She was preparing for something else entirely. As the 5th day after Adam's burial began, a stillness settled over the land, the kind of quiet that seems to arrive just before something enormous is about to happen. She knew, the texts say, that her remaining time was no longer measured in days. It was measured in hours. And in those final hours, she did something that no one before her had ever done, something that would become, in the oldest traditions, the very first model for every great gathering of family and community that would follow for thousands of years afterward. She called for everyone. Every child she had borne, every grandchild, every descendant scattered across the valleys and hillsides nearby, all of them were summoned to come to her. And they came, walking for hours across rough ground, climbing down from distant ridgelines, gathering in numbers that represented, at that point in history, essentially the entire human family on Earth. They stood together in front of the cave in a silence so complete that the old accounts describe it as though the world itself had gone quiet to listen. When she rose to speak to them, she did not look like a woman near death. She looked, the texts say, like someone who had already crossed over into something else and had simply returned long enough to deliver one final message. She had no possessions to leave behind, no land, no wealth, nothing material at all. What she had instead were words, and those words would echo through every generation that followed. She told them that a day was coming when the whole earth would be covered by water, a flood vast enough to wash away the corruption that had already begun spreading among the descendants of the first family. And she told them that this would not be the only reckoning. Far beyond that, further down the long road of time than any of them could imagine, another judgment would come, this time not by water, but by fire, a trial that would test the entire world. But she did not leave them only with warnings. She told them with absolute certainty that her bloodline would survive both. Neither the flood nor the fire would erase her descendants from the earth. And she told them something more specific still, that from her own line, far in the future, one particular descendant would come who would accomplish something no human being before or since would be able to do. He would find his way back through the gates that had been sealed shut behind her and Adam at the very beginning, and he would not go back alone. He would bring every one of them with him. It was, by every account that has survived, the first promise of a Redeemer ever given to humanity, spoken not by a king, not by a priest, not from a temple or a palace, but by a dying woman at the mouth of a cave, addressing a crowd of grieving descendants who had only ever known a world outside the garden. She delivered it not as a guess or a hope, but as something she had been shown directly, with the same certainty she had used to describe the gold in the riverbed and the fragrance of the tree. On the sixth day, she stopped breathing. According to the old accounts, the ground beneath the cave did not simply remain still. It began to move gently, rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, as though the earth itself recognized what had returned to it. The texts describe this as the earth welcoming back the substance from which the first human body had originally been formed. Her sons prepared her body with a level of care the old writings describe as the first funeral rites ever performed by human hands. They wrapped her in fine cloth and covered her with fragrant resins drawn from sacred wood, gestures that no one had ever performed before, but that would be repeated, in one form or another, by nearly every culture that came after. Every motion was deliberate, carried out as though each person performing it understood they were establishing something that would outlast them by thousands of years. They carried her into the cave where the treasures of the first family had been kept since the beginning, gold and incense and fragrant resin, gifts that had been set aside since the earliest days as tokens of a promise yet to be fulfilled. And there, they did not place her in some separate corner, away from her husband. They laid her directly beside him, in the same resting place, exactly as the two of them had been at the very beginning, before anything had gone wrong. The old texts call this moment the marriage of the grave, the final reunion of two people who had been formed from a single origin, separated by the world's first tragedy, who had endured nearly 1,000 years of exile side by side, and who were now, at last, brought back together in stillness. And then, according to the same accounts, something happened that defied explanation. The gold and the resin that had sat untouched in that cave for generations suddenly released a fragrance so powerful that it could be detected far beyond the mountain itself. People who lived miles away reported smelling something they had never encountered before, something that did not match any plant or flower they knew. It was as though the scent of the garden itself, the same fragrance she had carried in her memory for 1,000 years, had been sealed inside those offerings the entire time, waiting for this exact moment, and was finally released into the world now that the two halves of the first family were together again. If this story carries this much weight, why does almost no one know it? The honest answer is that the writings that preserve it were never part of the small collection of texts that became the standard scriptures most of the world grew up with. The traditions of the Ethiopian Church preserve a far larger library of ancient material than most other branches of Christianity ever retained, including writings about Adam and Eve that go into far more detail about their lives after Eden than anything found elsewhere. These texts were copied for centuries inside isolated highland monasteries, places that history largely passed by. They were written in Guizi, a language few outside Ethiopia ever learned to read, and for a very long time they remained essentially unknown to the wider world. It was only in the 19th century that scholars working with Ethiopian manuscripts began producing translations into European languages, and even then, these texts were treated as curiosities, interesting but peripheral, rather than as central pieces of the larger story. What survives in them is a portrait of the first woman that looks nothing like the simplified version most people grew up with. She is not reduced to a single moment or a single mistake. She is shown as someone who lived for centuries afterward, who raised generations of children, who carried the memory of paradise inside her like something precious and fragile, and who, at the very end of her life, used her final hours not to dwell on what had gone wrong, but to make absolutely certain that hope survived her. The monks who copied these texts again and again by candlelight in stone rooms carved into cliffs did so because they understood something important. The story of how humanity began is incomplete without her voice in it. For 6 days, she was the only person alive who remembered what had been lost. And rather than let that memory die quietly with her, she spent those 6 days giving it away, piece by piece, to everyone who would listen. She did not die believing the story was over. She died believing it was only the beginning of something much longer, and that one day, far in the future, the gates she had walked through in sorrow would open again. If a story this old, this detailed, and this central to the human family could remain hidden in mountain monasteries for over 1,000 years before reaching wider attention, it raises an obvious question. What else might still be sitting in those same archives, waiting to be read again for the first time in centuries? The traditions of the Ethiopian highlands hold far more than this single account, and the deeper one looks into them, the more the familiar outline of the earliest chapters of human history begins to look like only a small piece of a much larger picture.